Merry Meet Annie here, and I am making Kifi, or I'm starting to make Kifi. And Yetta, I swear, I hear you, woman, I hear you screaming all the way over to my house from your far away home. To all of you who have been interested in the making of Kifi incense, finally all of my ingredients have come in, so I am making it. And I am going to share the process as I make it, which will take the next 13 plus days, and then a couple of weeks, I should say, of curing, of drying out, and then just about the solstice, my Kifi will be ready. Now, are you familiar with Kifi? We used to make it in my first circle. It was our ritual incense, our temple incense, what we used for all of the rituals that we did high magics in. And it has a beautiful history to it. And the reason that first circle that I was in used it is we were very close with a Fellowship of Isis circle out of New York City at the time. This was in the 70s or so, somewhere in that decade. And they used it because they were honoring the Egyptian history of Kifi. And we loved it. And we decided to, once a year, as a coven, make the incense. It's a very detailed recipe, and it is done as a spiritual meditation over a period of a couple of weeks. Let me tell you a little bit about Kifi if you are not aware of it. It was an incense used in ancient Egypt, and the Greeks came in contact with it and probably were the first people who wrote down a recipe for it. What's interesting is we use the word Kifi to describe it, and probably was taken from the Egyptian word which the Greeks adopted, that word being kapet. More than likely, kapet in Egyptian only meant incense in the generic sense. It probably covered all of the many incenses that the Egyptians used in their temples. So that word, which the Greeks then kind of took and changed into Kifi, probably didn't describe a particular incense. It probably was the word for either incense or sacred or temple incenses as a category. But we know it now as Kifi because it is what the Greeks called it. The Greeks also made a kind of mistake in that they found it in records, they found it on temple walls, and they decided it was one thing, when more than likely every god worshipped in every temple had its own form of incense, which was what was offered to it. Our best guess is that the Kifi recipe that this one I'm going to share is based on probably was used in temples to honor Ra. And the only reason we say that is this recipe mimics what was found and then what the Greeks recorded for us that was used in the temples to Ra. We can't duplicate it exactly for some fascinating reasons, and one of the reasons is some of the ingredients listed, we don't know what they are. Even the Greeks didn't know what they were. They weren't familiar with the words. So we not only don't have an accurate recipe for Kifi, but it probably was many different things, even to the Egyptians, with different things added into it. What was a given is it was full of a lot of resins, for the simple reason that they were going for the luxurious and the exotic and the expensive. And since Egypt was in a position to import exotic things from all over the then known world, they pulled things in that were not part of their local area. Trees that could not be grown there because in general there weren't too many trees. Different botanicals and herbs and resins that were not part of the local Egyptian scene, but imported at great expense by the Egyptians. These early forms of Kifi were seen not only to honor the gods, but they were seen as medicinal. And when the Greeks took that home with them, they focused very powerfully on the medicinal aspect of Kifi. Now, as I'm making this video, I'm going to be making the base for the Kifi. it will in the end be a pellet, which I make about the size of a pea and would have been made even bigger than that in hunks, walnut-sized pieces to use in temple offerings. I make them about the end of my little finger into a pellet because I find that being very rich, beautifully, beautifully heavy, you don't want to do too many of those at one time. You'll just smoke yourself out of house and home. Yeah, the walnut-sized ones would be fine if you were outside, but as I'm talking to you a bit about Kifi, I'm also going to make the base. The base is kept in an airtight container, and it is stirred over a period of time while we are making the rest, the dry ingredients of the incense recipe. What I'm putting in here are raisins. The base is going to be raisins and dates, lotus oil, honey, and then covered with wine and steeped. Steeped for almost 2 weeks because it's going to take us 2 weeks to make the rest of this recipe. I'm going to share the recipe with you, but for now we're working on the base. Now, basically, if you're making a small batch of Kifi, the recipe calls for about 50 raisins. I have a little plate here, which is kind of my Kifi plate that I've used over the years. I make a large batch when I make it because I give a lot of it away. I know if I cover the bottom of this so the bottom can't be seen anymore, that I have as much raisins as I want to use in my recipe. So that is what I'm doing now, is adding the raisins to my jar. So let me tell you a little bit more about Kifi. And while I'm telling you that, I'm going to be chopping up some dates. Dates are another part of the recipe that is the wet recipe that's going to steep. And I know from experience in the past, if I fill my little cut glass plate to the very, very top with very finely minced dates, it is the right amount of dates for a large recipe like I'm going to make. A little bit about Kifi. We have information from Plutarch, who in his travels encountered in the temples of Ra the incense blend, which he named Kifi. Like I said, it may not have been named that, it may not even have had a name. It was just what was used for the particular incense in the temples of Ra. He described that it was this amazing, amazing incense that had properties of healing, not just that it was an offering to the gods. He described it, and he was describing how wonderfully it smelled. That smelling Kifi was like listening to the most beautiful, of music. The most beautiful of music was what Kifi smelled like. Isn't that beautiful and poetic? And he talked about in the temples that honored Ra, that they burned incense, traditionally at morning, at daybreak, at noon, and as the sun went down. And he reported that the incense that they burned at those period of times were frankincense at dawn, myrrh at noon, and in the evening, Kifi. He brought that information back with him, and he wrote about it. The recipes for Kifi at the time were very complicated. This is only going to be a small taste of how complicated they were. It seemed the minimum number of ingredients was 13. That doesn't count the base, but the minimum number of ingredients was 13. And it went up as high as 16. There were some temple recipes that were 24. The numbers themselves were sacred to the manufacturers, the priests that made it. So they could vary from site to site. The original Kifis were probably date and raisin and honey based. All the recipes for Kifi that have come down to us over time, the one thing they all have in common, no matter how different they might be, is they are heavy, very odoriferous, a lot of resins, and they all have raisins, dates, and honey. So all the recipes that you will find, and you will find many recipes if you want to Google Kifi, that's K-Y-P-H-I, will have those at least in the ingredients. The earlier versions of it, though, the very earliest ones that they found and even found on some temple walls, the illustrations of it being made and the way in which it was made, the recipes, were honey-based, and some of them early on, it was a honey only and then boiled down to make a very, very thick syrup to use for the base. And my recipe does, at the end of the process, boil down what's going to be in this jug, which is the dates and the raisins and the other things we're going to add in there. So mine does call for boiling down before mixing it in with the dry ingredients. So that goes back to that early time. We have another Greek, Dioscorides, to thank for recording some of the versions of Kifi and for promulgating them as herbal remedies, as pharmacies, really, pharmaceuticals, as healing smoke. And he captured some of the options on what Kifi might be in his writings. So we're talking still very, very ancient times with this history of where did this come to us from and how was the information captured. Greeks traveling to Egypt are the ones who captured this for us in ancient times. And when Dioscorides captured it, he included it in his writings and became then something that was known a lot more easily and known for its healing. And in fact, that's what he encouraged the use of it for. So if I keep doing a little sideways dance on you while I'm waving the blade around at you, it's because I do have my notes on my laptop next to me because I just want to make sure I didn't forget the things I wanted to say. All the healing aspects that Dioscorides captured for Kifi became part of the mythology that centered around it and the power of it. So this will be in addition to its power as a temple offering in the temples of Ra. And the things that he caught, I've got them written down here, the things that he captured and had been captured in that time about the healing aspects of Kifi were: it cured snake bites, asthma, and bad breath. It lulled one to sleep. It alleviated anxiety, increased dreaming, eliminated sorrow, and it chased away the troubles of the day. Well, I'm here to tell you that some of that is indeed very, very true. I do find that burning Kifi very much takes away troubles of the day, anxieties or worries that come from the life that we live. It kind of like puts them in some sense of priority in the bigger scheme of things, backs them off a bit. Very, very good for sleeping, extremely good for dreaming. Burning Kifi when you're sleeping really brings on some interesting things. Of course, I would encourage you only to do that if you have a safe way to burn Kifi while you are sleeping. It is also really good used in meditating because it gets you to that kind of flying place that you get to when you are sleeping. So all these different health attributes were attributed to Kifi. It also was known to be, because it was reported to the Greeks, known to be something that the Pharaoh wanted to take with him into the afterlife, a very particular thing, a valuable thing that he wanted to take with him into his afterlife. And actually the story around that is that it was going to keep Pharaoh's sex life very healthy in the afterlife. And the symbolism there is that being representative of the land and the fecundity of the land and the vitality of the land, one wanted one's Pharaoh to have a very active sex life in the afterlife because it impacted, on this side, everything from crops to livestock to the virility and power of the people. So he really wanted him to be happy in that way in the afterlife, and he believed that by having a goodly supply of Kifi with him in the afterlife, we could think of it as the Viagra of the ancient times, that he was set for the afterlife as far as that was concerned. A very important part of the mythology and the power of what it was to the ancient Egyptians.